Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 2 of Alien. We are astrobiology lessons for an interdisciplinary education network. And today we are so excited for our interviewee, but I will start by introducing myself. My name is Ariel. I'm an undergraduate student at Arizona State University studying biomedical sciences and data science. And I have my co-host here with me, so...
Hello, my name is Charlie. I am also an undergraduate at Arizona State. I study astrobiology, and I also minor in French, if there are any French-speaking listeners out there. And we have a new co-host with us today, joining us for episode 2. So, Ava.
Yes, my name is Ava. I'm also an undergrad student at Arizona State, and I currently study biological sciences and astrobiology.
Wonderful. And today we are interviewing Mark Hauber. So he is a professor of comparative psychology and a long-term practicing ornithologist at the City University of New York. He's a native of Hungary, graduate of Cornell and Yale, and has been a faculty member in Auckland, Illinois, and now he's in New York City. He's published over 400 peer-reviewed papers on brood parasitic birds, egg coloration, and the neuroendocrine basis of species recognition. So we are so excited to have you, Mark. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so Mark, before we get into some more field-specific questions, could you tell us a little bit about what drew you to ornithology and how you ended up where you are in your career today?
Sure. I'm actually a terrible model person because I always wanted to study birds. Ever since I was 5 years old, I love birds. I knew that ornithology was going to be my discipline. If I had stayed in Hungary, I would have become a veterinarian who studies birds or cures birds. But I was lucky enough to come to the U.S. and become an ornithologist directly. And because that was a possibility and a career option here. So birds just have always fascinated me. I wanted to be a bird. And so the closest thing you can do is to study birds.
Awesome. If you were going to be a bird, what bird would you be?
If I was going to be a bird, I would be a swallow, of course, because you can fly really fast, really long distances, and, you're social. If you're like a house martin in Europe, or if you're a cliff swallow here in the U.S. So, you've got lots of buddies to hang out with, and you get to build your own nest. So, what's better than that?
Exactly. That sounds awesome. I want to be a swallow.
Yeah.
Okay. So some of the questions that we have for you, let's first start off with, how is an organism's behavior affected by its environment in a nutshell? And how can an organism's behavior affect its environment?
Yes, that's a great question. We always used to think that, it's the environment that affects the behavior, whether it's temperature or light or noise levels, so COVID was a great experiment for birds. Of course, it was a great experiment for human survival too. Can we develop vaccines, in time to prevent, the 5% mortality that COVID was. But, while we stayed at home, noise levels dropped, right? There were very few cars driving around San Francisco, for instance, and the birds became louder and they changed their tunes. So that they occupy the ranges where the traffic noise was before. There's lots of other examples. I think there's a new paper circulating its way through during the solar eclipse. Birds, went to sleep, and the nighthawks came out. And so both the light and the sound levels, during these quasi-experimental setups, have had major impacts. So we know that happens. Birds are great because you can just do playbacks, right? You can pretend to be another bird nearby, whether it's the same species or different species. and say, hey, you've got a new companion. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to chase them away because they are competitors? Are you going to welcome to the family because they are potential cooperators? If you're a male, are you going to display because it's a potential mate? If it's a female, are you going to do the same? Display and say, hey, there's a new potential mate here as well. So, there's a lot of data to show that the environment affects the behavior. The behavior affecting the environment and behavior affecting the course of evolution is very, very, different in terms of data richness. But we know it happens. Birds are what Darwin called niche constructors, right? So they build nests, which of course are the original tools. If the definition of a tool is an environmental object that you modify for a particular purpose, the nest is, the original tool that birds build for reproduction. It's not as fancy as, sort of a modified twig for fishing out termites by chimps, for instance, or, other tools that New Caledonian crows make to fish out beetle grubs from trees. But, nests are pretty sophisticated. And so, they leave the environment modified. These leaves, these amalgamation of twigs and leaves and spider webs can serve as nesting material for ants, for other birds. They can catch on fire and sort of be the hub of environmental change. There's even claims that perhaps some birds have moved some twigs on fire, to just spread the fire in places. I think it's probably urban legend, but the idea that just like beavers are modified a habitat to generate giant dams and lakes, some of the avian constructions can be similar in impact too.
Wow, that's so cool. Like in astrobiology, we're very interested in what can we look at in an environment to see if something's living there. So bioindicators, stuff like that. So I like how you described nests as sophisticated structures, because like when astrobiologists do look for these things, they kind of have to tell, like, is there complexity involved in this? Could this be replicated by chance, or is this definitely something deliberate that an organism created? So that's
I love it. Yeah. There are, with the cliff swallows, if you have, 1,000 replicated structures that are, sort of cup-like and have an opening, at their main entrance, which is a tube, that's a biological creature that created it, right? With burrows, it's different, right? Like, so if you go to, the colony in the winter of bank swallows, for instance, or, Europeans call them sand martins. They just dig burrows into the ground, in like sandbanks. That could be done by other things. It could be some sort of water, or it could be wind movement or something like that. But when you have the same structure, especially if there's a nesting chamber at the end, replicated 100, 200 times, you gotta know it's a biological generated form or structure. It's especially if it happens in this particular spot, but not in a very similar spot, like 100 meters away or something like that.
Yeah, things like burrows where it's less clear whether it was biological or not are one of the challenges astrobiologists have to think about when looking for signs of life, because sometimes it's beneficial for life to make it look like it was a natural part of the environment, but that makes the job of finding the life a lot more difficult.
Yeah, so if you're like if the planet you're looking at was full of shorebirds, you would be very unlikely to find a nesting structure, right? It's a little scraping in the ground, near the water's edge, maybe a couple of pebbles, sort of put around, randomly, but, sort of raising the ground a little bit. And, if there are some eggshells there or anything like that, or sort of, impressions of the eggshells in the sand, after they hatched and the shells were removed, it would be very, very difficult to say, like, this was the nest of, some sort of plover or a sandpiper.
Wow, so cool. All right.
Alrighty then. So the next question that we have for you is basically, can you predict what kind of organisms, behaviorally speaking, might be present in a particular environment based on environmental factors?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm looking at a drawing of a myna, which is a starling-like bird from India, and we know that in cities, even after 150 years, which is not very much time, they change their beak morphology, right? The cities have different kind of foods, like lots of garbage, maybe leftover rice or dog food. And so their beaks, which are their primary foraging structures, are very different in cities compared to rural areas where they more go for earthworms and caterpillars and grasshoppers, right? And so we know that their environment, modifies their morphology. Same thing with flight. Actually, the first time I was ever involved with astrobiology was not really about birds, but about instruments that were trying to be landed on Mars in a windy on a windy day. And so, what's better to model, a windy landing than a seabird like a gannet or a gull landing on a windy cliff? And so they were trying to modify their instrument to detect, rocks and other elements and objects, on Mars by landing like a bird on a windy cliff. And so, these birds are perfectly fine. They have huge wings. The surface area is large enough. It's round enough that they can control their landing. And so the instrument that we were designing was something like that. Had large surface, round, wing-like structures that were responsive to the environment itself. So it was sort of like reverse engineering a bird. But you could say the same, once you're on, sort of like an area with lots of thermals, you want to have, the kind of wings that vultures and storks have, because they are the ones we use for migration, these thermals. If you're like flying over the ocean, on open water with wind and waves, you want to have a long, narrow wing like an albatross or a petrel, because that will catch, the disturbances, generated by the waves, but also keep you afloat, flying over the water without having to flap very much. And so, if you're in the forest, in a busy habitat, with lots of features and twigs and leaves and flowers and branches and bark, you want to have, sort of short-rounded wings so that you can maneuver around those habitat features. So, absolutely, you can look at the environmental factors and say this would be the ideal bird morphology that occurs there.
Yeah, interestingly enough, like the major example of natural selection is Darwin's finches and how he figured out that that's going on. Like if there's some sort of drought period, your finches are going to have very different beaks, like the finches that survive and pass those traits on. So that's pretty cool. There's so much more to birds than just beaks. But yeah, the influence of natural selection on populations is so interesting, especially when we look at in astrobiology context, if we're trying to look for potential alien life, and we have to really take the environment into consideration, because environments do shape organisms. Yeah.
Absolutely. And they shape the rate of speciation, the environmental variation. I mean, with these miners, 150 years, is enough to change, whether it's genetic change, an epigenetic change, a developmental change is another question, but over time, these kind of changes can be incorporated into, sort of genomic changes through special processes. And so that's what we saw with the Darwin's finches or the Hawaiian honey creepers.
Yeah, and I think your mention of your collaboration with this Mars project is so fascinating and such a great example of how interdisciplinary space work and astrobiology efforts are, because you can take influence from areas like ornithology and impact the creation of a Mars rover. That's something I would have never thought to overlap, but that's so awesome that that's something that you worked on.
Yeah, I was very lucky, but this was when I was moving to Illinois, which is a major engineering school, and so a lot of NASA-funded projects were there. And my collaborator was studying wing structure in birds, figuring out why it's actually at the tip of the fingers, there are extra feathers, in the oa to figure out what does that do to the bird itself, and being able to stabilize it in the environments, and then how that can translate into a Mars landing device.
Awesome. So cool.
Wow. Incredible.
So cool.
Yeah.
I'm excited to be invited by you guys because, I'd love to see another planet with birds. But I never thought that somebody would ever ask me about, my seabird research and how that relates to, astrobiology.
We're so glad to have you. Thank you so much for being here. This is really cool. Yeah, I feel like this kind of translates well into the next question, which is how interactions between species, so this could include competition, cooperation, mutualism, predation, how can this lead to measurable changes in an environment or ecosystem over time? And if you have any outstanding examples of this that you're thinking of, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, that's a really good question because, we know that, for instance, parasitism, which is, the idea that some birds lay their eggs into other birds' nests, results in changes in the egg morphology of both the host and the parasite. So the parasite often becomes mimetic of the host, and the host becomes, more spotty, differently spotty, uniquely spotty. So the females can identify their own eggs and tell the foreigner's eggs apart from their own in the clutch itself. But how does that relate to environmental features? And one aspect is, of course, nests. We know that enclosed nests or more hidden nests, so cavity nests or a tunnel-based nests are more likely to be evolve in response to brood parasitism. So if you had, like a parasitic species in a habitat, you would more likely to have tunneling birds in nesting environments, or birds that build sort of large communal structures, or even cooperative species of birds. So birds where the habitat features allow multiple generations to live together. They chase the parasite away and they have to raise the next generation of offspring too. What does that look like? It depends. It depends what the nest looks like. If it's a cavity nest, there should be more cavities or tunnels. The other example I was thinking about is, of course, display site sexual selection, right? We study birds because a lot of species of birds are very colorful, but they are also really good engineers. And so species like manakins, which are little subaquine birds in Central and South America, they display to females as pairs. The alpha male and the beta male come together. They clear the habitat, so they take all the leaves, all the branches that are above and underneath this display site, And so they do this little buzzing display, jumping over each other, making noises. And then if the female is interested, she comes closer, the cleaner the habitat, she's more likely to observe the males. And at some point, she decides that it's time to mate. The alpha chases the beta away, and the alpha, gets to mate with the female. This is not a species where the pair stays together. The males will continue to display to other females. The female goes off, builds a nest, raises the offspring. But you can tell in sort of the non-breeding season that there are these display sites or lacks, because the habitat has been cleaned, the branches are missing, you can tell that somebody has been using it for a display. Another type of engineering by birds is, of course, the relatives of the birds of paradise. The birds of paradise are in Papua New Guinea and Australia, and they are just beautiful, plumage based display birds. But their relatives, the bowerbirds, build these elaborate structures which are to attract the females. So many bowerbirds don't have colorful, plumage or, sort of moderate plumage. But what they do is they build, sort of a theater of display. And so whether it's blue objects, lining a runway between two walls of grasses stuck into the ground, or sort of a large Christmas tree structure colored by colorful elytras of beetles and pebbles that are specifically shaped or specifically colored, or flower petals that are lined along the entrance to that structure. So if you find something like that, again, it's unlikely that it lasts for a long time, because these birds are also thieves. And so if one structure is not protected by the resident male, the neighboring males, take a lot of these structures away. But, at night or in the afternoon when nobody's displaying, if you walk around this habitat, you'll see these well-constructed, well-engineered structures that are clear evidence of life without looking at the birds themselves. So, my own example is I was near Brisbane in the mountains in Australia, and so the satin bowerbird, which itself is blue, likes to collect blue and yellow objects. And so because you see these little runways of grass, and then they use the straws, colorful straws from the nearby fast food shop to decorate their runway, their little bower. And then you can be mean to them and give them green straws, and so they have to clear those out. They hate blue, but they love yellow and they love blue. And so, you could be nice to them or you could be mean to them. But, the change in the composition of the spectral reflectance of these objects is a really great evidence of life, just being there, even if you never see a second bird.
That's an interesting sort of, the question is I wrote it as in interactions between species that aren't human, but that's a very interesting, human-bird interaction in a way.
As well. Yeah. So we think of, ourselves as artificial, anthropogenic features, but, we've been around for a long time. I mean, my favorite human-bird interaction is, of course, the honey guide, right? So honey guides speak the language of the local tribe in Africa, which is different in Zambia, which is different in Kenya, in Tanzania, and they call the humans to a honeybee hive so the human can harvest the honey, and the honey guide gets a piece of wax from the honeybee comb to consume. They're not there for the larvae, or the honey there for the comb. So consuming wax is actually a really difficult digestive thing. But my favorite is sometimes the honey guide leads the humans to the wrong place. There's no honeybee hive, or there's already a destroyed honeybee hive, and so it's not a perfect relationship, but you can you you follow the environmental cues, and then you find a way, to these honeybee hives. But just imagine from the human perspective, we're very good with spatial features. We know, our territories, our habitats. Like I know how to get to Grand Central train station from my house. But the honey guide has to have the same abilities. Like find a human somewhere randomly and then lead its human to the honeybee hive, which could be in any which direction. So it has to have the spatial memory features to be able to interact with that human, in addition to the vocal and visual features as well. But if you think of interactions, we looked at a lot at disturbance foraging. So what is disturbance foraging? It's the idea that whales or cattle or even small birds that follow, even birds that follow foraging ants, for instance, army ants, are benefiting from fish or insects being dislodged or scared by another organism, in the environment. And so disturbance foraging is basically eating the escaping grasshoppers and beetles or fish that are being dislodged by, the cattle, the army ants, or the whales. And so, we found that the eyes of these creatures that are following, other species are larger compared to other species even when we account for general foraging ecology. So we knew that, even foraging interactions result in different morphological features that can be detected, in the animals themselves. I'm trying to think, if there's an environmental impact on that. But what you would see is, foraging leftover sites. So, I studied hyena bones in my undergrad because hyenas, collect food items and they gnaw on the bones, and then they generate these deposits of mammalian, mostly herbivorous bones in the African savannas. And so there are two alternatives to that. One is human collected bones, right, which is important for our human evolutionary history. And the third possibility is streams, right? They just like carry the bones, and then, maybe there's a trough or something like that, and all the bones get deposited there. So is it an environmental, sort of a water-driven bone aggregation, or a hyena or a human-based bone aggregation? And it turns out that humans and hyenas process bones differently. They gnaw differently. They break them differently for the nutrients inside the bones. Humans really needed fatty substances, bone marrow, at some stage during their evolution, because they didn't have enough energy sources. There weren't enough carbs in the diet, and so bone marrow fat was essential, because if you eat protein only, then you actually lose energy. And so, it was a really fun project, because, you looked at these herbivorous bones, and then you looked at, how they were aggregated, where they were aggregated, and then figure out, like, are the break marks in the bones, due to riverine effects or human effects or hyena effects. And the same thing could be, done with sort of biologically collected deposits, whether it's stones or, bones themselves, in another plant.
Yeah, I think just a couple days ago, NASA released a press release about the Jezero crater on Mars and the possible evidence of life they found there, which were some interesting leopard spot type formations that might have been the results of some microbial reactions. Mm-hmm. So a similar kind of thing where it's like you can see the evidence of an organism based on the left behind parts in the environment. And also that's a really cool paper, and I'm excited to hear more about that situation as it progresses.
Yeah. No, I was in Guam once studying spiders, and it was, just an undergraduate project, super interesting. But I remember there was one waterfall which was, quite steep, but because the blue-green algae made this porous underlining structure in the waterfall itself, you could actually climb up, with bare feet, because it wasn't slimy, it wasn't slippery, it was actually, sort of the microporous nature of the calcium deposits, which are made by algae instead of, just water deposits, were very different. And so you could tell that there was underlying life because you could climb up the waterfall. It was like the craziest thing ever. But, I thought that was like really neat. And who knew that, these kind of deposits have such lasting impressions. But then you go to, Australia, where, you've got evidence for, billion-year-old life, again, blue-green algae deposits and structures that are generated by that.
That's so cool. That algae facilitated you climbing up that waterfall.
Exactly.
The interactions between species, help facilitate evolution, like further evolution and growth. And I think that my intuition would say that if we were to find a species of organism on another planet, there would be so many more species that would come along with that we would find, because trophic interactions and all of these things are just so important to earthen environments. It's very hard for me to see how it could be different elsewhere. So that's really cool.
And a lot of a lot of evidence for polymorphism, right? So like Daphne or water fleas, have a different shaped casket when there's a predator in the lake versus when there's no predator in the lake, right? And so you might say like, oh, maybe it's temperature, that's why they are different, or water turbidity, right? But it's actually the predator, the presence of the predator, that makes them different. And so even if you find only one species, a level of polymorphism is indicative, could be indicative of having other species nearby.
Wow, you could really make inferences based on that. That's incredible. That's very cool. As sort of like a cap to this question and an introduction to the next question, I was wondering if you could give everybody listening an introduction to cowbirds and brood parasitism, because the next question is about parasitism. So just a little introduction.
So we've got 10,000 bird species. It's the most diverse land vertebrate lineage. Although we're all fish, we just have to remember that. But we're walking or flying fishes. Birds represent the most parental lineage. So every species of bird, except for 1% of them, takes care of its own young. The egg, every bird is ovoparous, which means they lay their eggs instead of laying live young. And so those eggs have to be incubated, some sort of external or biological heat sources. So, talk about, really exciting sort of exceptions to the nest building. So these birds called megapodes, like brush turkeys, they actually, instead of incubating the eggs with their own body heat, they incubate the eggs with external sources of energy, so they can build a giant heap of rotting vegetation, keep it wet, and then the biochemical breakdown processes heat up the eggs themselves. Or they can just find a volcanic slope, where the volcanic heat keeps the sand warm, and you just scratch the sand and lay your egg inside there, and then the volcanic heat or the sun heat, incubates your eggs like a true reptile. But 1% of birds actually sneak their eggs into the nests of other species. We call them obligate brood parasites. And so cowbirds are these species in North America. Cuckoos and honey guides are these species in Europe and Africa and Asia. Every continent except for Antarctica has brood parasitic species. And so they represent about 100 species of birds, 7 evolutionary origins. So we've got parasitic finches, parasitic cowbirds. We've got 3 lineages of cuckoos, We've got honey guides and the parasitic duck, and obligate parasitic duck in South America. And so this behavioral exception to the parental rule has evolved 7 independent times. And they impact about 1,700 species of birds. So that's 17% of bird species are impacted by brood parasitism. So it's not a minor impact. This is 1 in 5 birds is probably the host to a brood parasite.
So for only about, so when you say there's 7 different evolutionary lineages, that means there's more than 7 species, though.
Absolutely, yeah. So the cuckoos, have like 35 species. The cowbirds have 5 or 6 species. The whiters have like at least 20 species. But each of them, they're more closely related to each other than anybody else. Mm-hmm. So when you try to understand, like, what are the genes that make you brood parasites, you can't just compare 2 finches because chances are they share the same genes that make them brood parasites. So you want to compare the parasitic finches to the parasitic cowbirds or the parasitic cuckoos. And so we actually have a manuscript in consideration doing just that, like what are the genes that make you a brood parasite compared to a parental bird.
Wow. Well, that leads pretty well into asking what are the benefits of being a parasite? Why did this happen 7 different times in evolutionary history? And could different environments convey different advantages to parasites? And if so, what could these advantages be?
So the benefits of parasitism, you have to ask your parents, because they love you very much, but they also, spent a lot of time on you, when they were young and they just, you when you arrived, there was a lot of feeding, a lot of crying, a lot of nightless or sleepless nights. And so, parental care is costly. You basically have to decide, like, am I going to take care of myself or my child? And if I have a child, am I going to have a second child? Am I going to have a third child? Right? So brood parasites overcome that cost by saying, I'm going to lay a lot of eggs and I'm going to put them into somebody else's nest, and I don't have to incubate them. I don't even have to build a nest, but I certainly don't have to feed them, and don't worry about the teenagers, right? And so their trade-off is laying lots of eggs, but not all those eggs are going to make it. And why is that? Because the different species of hosts have also lived with parasites, and so they don't want to raise somebody else's kid. They want to raise their own kids. And so they can tell the other parasitic eggs by color or shape or timing of egg laying. And so they are often able to toss out the cowbird egg or the finch baby or the cowbird fledgling or something like that. And so the question is, what kind of environments are amenable for brood parasitism is really interesting, because there's a super strong correlation between cooperative species presence and brood parasitism. So the more cooperative species, which means mom, dad, and maybe the first generation of offspring are helping to raise the second generation of offspring. And that happens a lot in habitats that are environmentally highly fluctuating, right? So, if you don't have enough food to raise your own offspring, you might as well recruit helpers. And so you can have a larger territory, you can have a more secure food source. Babies don't need that much food, but they need it regularly. Adults can, sort of go for a day or two, starving, but the babies can't, they need to continuously grow. And so by having this workforce in drought-driven habitats, or in less predictable habitats, generates cooperative breeding. But then cooperative breeding is both amenable and a good opposition to brood parasitism. The larger the group, the more likely the parasitic bird to find it. But then the larger the group, the more likely the host is able to fight off the parasite as well. So we found that environmental features also affect how much of a generalist you are. So drought factors, or other predictors of environmental variability were positively related to how many host species you're parasitizing. So, it's much more likely to evolve in stable habitats, a single host, single parasite type of relationship. But the more variable the environment, the better your ability to bet your hedges or hedge your bets, sorry, should be. And so, those are the species that have multiple host species. And so there's again, when I said, 7 independent origins of brood parasitism, 100 species of brood parasites, that's why we have 1,700 species that are potential hosts, because one host species like the brown-headed cowbird here in North America or the shining cowbird in South America can parasitize over 200 or 300 host species.
Wow, I like that sort of idea that life can find a way. It's just another example of that, because even though the environment is super highly fluctuating, it conveys these different benefits to different styles of behavioralism and like rearing and stuff like that. So that's pretty cool for inferring organismal behaviors from the environment.
Absolutely. And even the evolution of brood parasitism is more likely to happen in areas with species interactions. So, predation is the main cause of egg loss and chick loss in birds. And we think that predation was the driving factor for the evolution of brood parasitism. So all birds came with parental traits, but some birds had their nest disappear halfway through the laying cycle, right? Imagine if you're a red blackbird and you lay 4 or 5 eggs, and then on day 3, when you're laying your eggs, you lay one egg at a day. Your egg goes missing. A bird came in, destroyed the nest, ate your eggs, or a snake came in, ate your eggs. There's nowhere to lay or nowhere safe to lay. So what do? You might sneak into somebody else's nest and lay your upcoming egg there, because you already have a physiologically committed egg coming down your oviduct. So you have to lay that egg, and you're better off not laying it on the ground, but laying it in somebody else's nest. And so we've actually done an experiment like that with zebra finches. We had 3 nests in a zebra finch cage. One of them was the bird's own nest, one of them was an empty nest, and one of them was a nest with eggs. And the birds, when we removed their own nest on day 2, were preferentially laying their eggs into the nest with eggs. So they were monitoring the content of the nest, and they knew how to parasitize the other birds or the other nests that were potentially available for parasitism.
That's absolutely incredible. Brood parasitism is so cool. I wish we could talk about it the whole time. We do have about 15 minutes left, so maybe this can be a good chance to funnel into our final question, Ava.
So our final question of the day is going to be, how are birds one of the most vital aspects of the environment? As in, what is their importance to our environment? How do they contribute to it? What are the relationships between birds and even humans?
Absolutely. So birds are great because they can be top predators. They can be the prey. They can be sort of granivores and very close to the bottom of the food chain. So you can have like an entirely avian-based plant bird ecosystem, right? And in fact, in a lot of islands, that's what you have. The islands are difficult to occupy or difficult to migrate to if you're a mammal, right? Like just imagine you're a mouse or a rat, floating on some, a vegetation. It's not necessarily that you're going to float, to the proximity of a small Pacific island. But if you're a cuckoo or, some sort of a land bird, being dislodged during a big storm, you see green landscape, from a couple hundred yards up in elevation, you're going to land there, right? So islands, are often occupied by, plants, insects, and birds. And so, you can have entire ecosystems based on that. Regarding the human context, I always tell people it's easy to study birds because they have sort of the same general senses that we do. They are very good with vision. In fact, they're much better than us. They see ultraviolet colors, and they have 4 cone receptors, color receptors in their eyes.
Wow.
Yeah, they are also better. They are also, very acoustically driven, right? They sing beautiful songs or make loud calls, and in fact, they're much better than we are because their temporal resolution of the sound is much more detailed and fine-tuned than ours. And then they're okay with olfaction. They have it. They can use it just like we have it. We can use it, but it's not the major cue for our social interaction. So we, sort of think we understand birds, even though we really don't, because they're much better at some things. The one thing they are not better is, except for hawks and eagles, of course, is visual acuity. So we studied robins in the context of parasitism, and we did different pixelation of blue and yellow colors, so that, if the pixel was too small, they would be seen as green. And so the birds would accept their own eggs that were 3D printed and covered in this pixelated color paper. And we almost missed the threshold of the robins because they were really bad at getting the visual acuity right. So, we thought these like giant blue and yellow dots would be seen as spotted eggs by the birds, and they barely were. So we almost missed their thresholds. But if you did the same thing with like a peregrine falcon or an American kestrel, they would outshine any human, of course, because their visual acuity is so great. So, in some ways, we share the sensory world with the birds. In some ways, we're better, and in many ways, we're worse.
Wow.
Yeah, birds can see ultraviolet. That's
Yeah.
one thing we'll never be able to do.
No, well, actually, there's one person in Scotland that I heard. She's a mutant, and one of her short wavelength receptor actually reaches into the UV. So she's like one of the humans that can see ultraviolet, but it's 1 in 7 billion or 8 billion.
Wow.
Newton is right. Like, she used to be in the X-Men or something.
Yeah, she really is. She really is. But there are primates in the New World, where the males are monochromats. They just see one color, or they have one color receptor, but the females have 2, and then some males have 2 and polymorphic. So the primate lineage is actually really interesting when it comes to color vision. Older, sort of like African and Asian primates are much better at color than some of the America's primates.
Wow, that's so
and it's
cool.
about fruit, right? Like looking at ripe fruit.
Yeah.
When you see the color, you get it. When you don't see the color, you have to try.
Yeah, I mean, again, just another example of many of how the environment can shape your physiology and your behavior as an organism. And I like what you said about how we do share a lot with birds, because we can think about model organisms for different things we want to study. And I mean, like, that whole thing with you working with birds to figure out what could be the best lander is just an example of that. Birds can clearly be a model for technological objects, and for species like humans too, if we were to try to do some sort of simulation about that. That's really interesting.
Exactly.
Wow. Does anybody have any closing remarks about how the environment shapes organisms, how organisms shapes environments, bioindicators, parasitism?
Yeah, I think this conversation has been great, Mark. Thank you so much for coming again. I feel like I've learned a lot more about how not only birds, but just organisms in general can impact their environment and adapt, and how we see that reflected through lineages. So that's super, super cool. I've come away with so many more examples of that than I ever would have had before.
Thank you
Same
so much.
here. Yeah, definitely.
It's fun to talk to people who are in a spaceship too.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. This is such an incredible learning experience. And I just hope that to anybody who's listening, this is an example of how cool interdisciplinary collaboration can be, as Charlie mentioned earlier, is that we are learning from each other. Well, we're really learning from Mark, but
I learned a lot today too. The way you ask the questions, it's like I never knew or thought that my research can be relevant to astrobiology. Like I knew it was relevant to dinosaur egg colors, so I knew it was okay to go back in the past and look at dinosaur egg colors, which is a really interesting field. And Mark Morrell, who was part of that discovery, unfortunately just died this week. But they're forward looking, right? And that aspect I never thought of.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're always happy to talk about astrobiology.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you're listening, tune in for more episodes if you like what you heard today. We're going to be talking to so many different people. You can find our Instagram right there on the podcast page. You can find our YouTube channel. If you're on our YouTube channel, you can find our Spotify and our Instagram. So yeah, we're so happy to have you. I'm going to end this recording real quick right now. So yeah, hope you have a great day.